Dear comrades and friends, 100 years ago today, Karl Liebknecht spoke here in Berlin at the Potsdamer Platz and called upon workers to oppose the war. The mass slaughters on the battlefields of World War I had been raging for almost 2 years. Millions had already died. In the midst of this terrible war, Liebknecht courageously raised his voice. His appeal against war comprised of 3 points. He began with the collapse of the Second International and spoke about the devastating effects of the betrayal of the SPD, which has agreed to war credits in 1914. He explained the class character of the war and spoke out against the capitalist profiteers. And he stressed that there is only one force that could put an end to the carnage: the proletariat on the basis of an international socialist program. In his call to the demonstration, Liebknecht wrote, "The proletarian international cannot be re-established in Brussels, Den Haag, or Bern by a few dozen functionaries. It can only be established by the activity of millions. It can only be established here in Germany and over in France, in England and in Russia, when masses of workers everywhere take up the banner of the class struggle and raise their voices thunderously against the genocide." 1 year later, Russian workers rose up against Tsarism and under the leadership of Lenin and Trotsky carried out a socialist revolution that ended the war. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were murdered after this revolution spread to Germany in November 1918. Here in Berlin, the SPD government, led by Ebert, Noske and Scheidemann, drowned the revolution in blood. Liebknecht and Luxemburg were killed before they could fully draw the lessons from the betrayal of the SPD. But Lenin and Trotsky emphasized that the struggle against war requires a relentless struggle against opportunism and nationalism. Today, 100 years later, all the unresolved problems of the last century are returning. Once again, German imperialism and militarism is rearing its ugly head. 2 years ago, the federal government announced the end of military restraint. Since then, militarism has been systematically promoted. In the German army, the Bundeswehr, is at the forefront of the NATO deployment against Russia in Eastern Europe, in wars in the Middle East, and even in Africa. According to the German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier, in an interview a few days ago, the situation today is more dangerous than during the Cold War. He continued, "The old order has not yet been replaced by a new order. The struggle for influence and hegemony is not taking place in a peaceful seminar environment, but is exploding violently." End of quote. The military buildup in Germany is being pursued with enormous speed and intensity. The German government has announced plans to increase military spending in the coming years by 130 billion euros. The spring report of the Bundeswehr listed 20 armament projects worth 60 billion euros. A new ultra-modern cyber strike force consisting of over 13,000 soldiers will be set up and equipped with the latest technology. In the early 30s, German militarism had already astonished the world when it rapidly overcame the defeat of the First World War and the limitations of the Versailles Treaty. In a very short time, they constructed one of the most modern and powerful army ever known. Today, German imperialism is once again striving to be in the front line of the global arms race. At present time, this policy is taking place in close cooperation with the US. In his recent visit to Germany, President Obama organized a war summit to prepare a new military offensive in Syria and Libya. Immediately afterwards, the Bundeswehr announced it would send troops and heavy military equipment to Lithuania in order to strengthen Western aggression against Russia. However, the resurgence of German militarism has not only intensified the confrontation with Russia, but also led to increased tensions between European powers. The specter of a European war returns, and the transatlantic conflicts can rapidly assume military forms. All parties support the military build-up and the drive to war. The SPD acts as cheerleader and leading warmonger. As for the Greens, they have long ago ditched their eco-pacifism and support the war drive on the basis of defending human rights. A particular treacherous role is played by the Left Party. Under the slogan of Unite Against Right, it supports the war parties and tries to stifle a socialist development in the working class. The trade unions also support the war policy. They demand protectionism and have formed an official pact between the DGB and the Bundeswehr. These parties and the media constitute a political conspiracy against the people. But unlike the situation 100 years ago when the SPD suppressed the revolution and rescued capitalism, the social democratic parties and the trade unions are losing influence. In the recent presidential elections in Austria, the SPÖ candidate, a former union president, gained just 11% of the vote and failed to make the second round. In France, thousands of workers and youth have been demonstrating for weeks against the labor market reforms of the Hollande government. And here in Germany, strikes in the public service and engineering industry developed last week. We welcome the growing rebellion against the social democratic parties and the trade unions. While the Left Party and all the pseudo-lefts desperately seek to maintain the authority of these bureaucracies, we fight for the political independence of the working class. But the anger and opposition of millions of people demand a new strategy. The struggle against social cuts, dictatorship and war requires the mobilization of the international working class on the basis of an anti-capitalist and socialist program. This is the significance of our international campaign against militarism and war. When we opposed right-wing professors and their war propaganda at the Berlin's Humboldt University, we won considerable support. We were able to repulse all the attempts by the university administration to intimidate us and to suppress our opposition to the grotesque falsification of history and trivialization of Nazi crimes. Early this year, we were able to quadruple the number of our representatives at the student parliament. We now have decided to expand this political campaign to factories and workplaces. We have put up our own candidates for the election to the Berlin House of Representatives this autumn and already started the election campaign. We are turning the election into a referendum against militarism and war. We will not allow the same corporations and banks that twice plunged the world into the abyss and committed the greatest ever war crimes to organize a third world war. We combine the militancy and the courage with which Karl Liebknecht opposed the First World War 100 years ago with the great political lessons contained in the history of the International Committee of the Fourth International. That is the big difference. 100 years ago, the SPD and the Second International collapsed and betrayed the working class. Today, our party is winning influence, a party that fought for decades under difficult conditions, but never gave up the struggle for international socialist program and assumed a powerful international cadre in this process. These principles win enormous actuality and force today. We call on you to join this fight. Thank you, comrades.